All engine running.
Absolute genius.
Get this.
Welcome.
This is the show where we bring you
Science.
What that essentially means is
discoveries,
Advances.
Questions. Research.
technology. Unbelievable.
Without further ado,
This is The Naked Scientists. Hello, welcome to The Naked Scientists podcast, the programme that brings you the biggest breakthroughs and talks to the major movers and shakers in the worlds of science, technology and medicine. I'm Chris Smith. This week, the UK commits to new nuclear, but is it going to be worth the hefty price tag? Also, with the NHS set to invest very heavily in robot surgeons, we'll be asking what they can and can't do. And the asteroid that might hit the moon. We talk about the art of spotting NEOs, as they're known.
From Cambridge University's Institute of Continuing Education, this is The Naked Scientists.
The UK government has committed more than £14 billion, about $30 billion, to build Sizewell C, a new nuclear power station on the Suffolk coast in the east of England. It's been heralded as the biggest investment in nuclear energy for a generation, and ministers say the project will power 6 million homes, create thousands of jobs, and help to usher in what they're dubbing a golden age of clean energy. But it is not without controversy. Opponents warn of ballooning costs, long construction delays, and much higher bills for consumers. And the project's true price tag and its value to British energy's future remain hotly debated. I've been speaking with Simon Taylor, who's the author of The Fall and Rise of Nuclear Power in Britain and an expert in energy policy and finance. He's based at Cambridge University's Judge Business School.
The government for some time has wanted to have new nuclear as part of its overall energy policy, not least because most of the old nuclear power stations in Britain either have closed or will be closing by the early 2030s. So the idea of building some new nuclear stations is at least partly just to keep nuclear as part of the overall energy mix. And that in turn is partly because it is a good idea in energy policy to have a range of options, not to put all of your eggs in one basket. Most of our energy in future is going to come from offshore wind, and that on the whole is a good and clean source of energy. But it isn't always windy, and so we do need alternatives. And nuclear has the advantage that it's always on. It runs 24 hours a day.
How do the costs stack up, though? And why do projects like this tend to start with one price tag? And as we've seen with Hinkley C, which is another project on the opposite side of the country, massive overruns. Why does this happen?
I think there's two aspects to this. Nuclear in recent years in both Western Europe and in the United States has had a very poor record in terms of construction. Several projects have gone well over time and over budget. And I'm afraid Hinkley Point C in the west of England is one of them. So there's something about building nuclear, at least in these countries, which we struggle with. And it's partly because we haven't done it for a very long time. But there is a broader question over big projects. It's not just nuclear. We've seen problems across the Western world. Doing big, complex construction projects seems always to bring troubles, and nuclear is a particularly complex type of construction.
The government are arguing that because they've done it once for Hinkley C, it'll be easier the second time for Sizewell C. Do you buy that?
The argument is that you learn by doing. And on the whole, there's a lot of evidence for this. Hinkley Point C is actually 2 reactors, and the construction team say, and there's every reason to believe them, that the second one has gone more quickly and smoothly than the first because they have learnt from it. And Sizewell C will be an identical copy. So in effect, you're building the 3rd and 4th reactors. And there's every reason to think, therefore, it should go more smoothly. That said, construction costs have gone up in the UK in recent years, and it remains a complex project where things can go wrong.
When it is ultimately completed, what's the business model for nuclear? And does that actually lead to cheaper energy? Or when one takes all of this massive costing into account, is it actually a very expensive way to generate power?
If you compare an additional unit of electricity from solar or wind or nuclear, at least in Britain and in Europe, and in the US currently comes out a lot more expensive because the capital costs are currently so much higher. However, if you look at it on a system basis and you say, what would it cost to build a whole decarbonized electricity system? To do that without nuclear is probably possible, but it gets very expensive when you're trying to decarbonize the last few units of electricity. You end up having to build a lot of extra wind or solar to cope with those periods when there's very little wind or sun. And in that context, having some nuclear, as long as the costs aren't too high, can overall be a sensible decision. But the government haven't actually made that case very effectively. But there is modelling work to suggest that nuclear can make sense on a system basis.
And if we consider not pounds, shillings, and pence, the physical financial cost of something, but we consider the carbon cost, is the case clearer for nuclear in those terms?
Well, the evidence on this, I think, is quite clear because the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change looked at this in detail several years ago. And on the basis of the whole life of a project, so from construction all the way through the years of generating electricity, nuclear is pretty similar to solar or wind in having very low carbon emissions per unit of electricity generated. And on that basis, nuclear can, I think, credibly be regarded as a low carbon source of electricity.
One way to do nuclear is this one: big scale, big infrastructure, one plant that serves many. The other way of thinking about this, which has come up much more recently, is the devolved approach of small modular reactors, which are smaller in scale and footprint, and they serve a smaller area, but they do it in a more bespoke way. The argument being that they're off a production line and you make many of them, therefore you make many economies of scale in making them. Now, how do the two compare? How do they stack up? Because the government seem to be hedging their bets here. They've also said they're going to invest in this technology. I think Rolls-Royce have got the gig for the UK. How do they look in comparison?
Traditionally, there have been economies of scale in nuclear, and that's why all around the world people tend to build reactors with 1,000 megawatts or more of capacity, and that's quite a big number because there are fixed costs of clearing a site, of security, insurance, regulation. All of these things have argued for building big. The argument for small modular reactors is that if you can mass produce them, so to speak, in a factory, you can get the unit cost of production down. The problem with big nuclear is that you're building a very complex and very specialized machine with lots of parts which are made specifically for that project. And that type of manufacturing is always going to be more expensive than if you use standardized units that you can build at scale. So the idea of small modular reactors is a very good one in principle, because if we can get to the point where we're producing large numbers of these things on a very controlled basis and we get the benefits of economies, that should bring the cost down. The problem is that these reactors don't yet exist. They are a concept and the designs look very interesting, but no one has actually built them yet.
Simon Taylor at the Judge Business School at the University of Cambridge. Robots are set to be rolled out to revolutionise the way the UK does surgery, we're told. Wes Streeting, the Secretary of State for Health, will pledge a major expansion of robotic surgery to cover 500,000 procedures, they say, within a decade. So, high ideals. He backed plans to use technology to boost productivity and cut waiting lists. According to a report, surgeons can get through operations more quickly, clearing waiting lists, and hospital stays will be halved because procedures are less invasive, so complication rates and healing times are both much lower. But how realistic are these claims? We put in a call to Mark Slag, a surgeon and co-founder of CMR Surgical, one of the world's leading medical robotics companies. They're headquartered in Cambridge.
Doing surgery by hand is extremely difficult, and only about 40% of surgery is done keyhole by surgeons holding the instrument by hand. And the reason it's only 40% is it's very difficult to do, and many people can't do it. So therefore, they stay doing open surgery. That's in the United States figures, 60% is open. The robot, it's quicker to train, quicker to get to the technique, and enable more people to do it. And therefore, it gives us the chance of increasing keyhole surgery from 40% up to 80 or 90%. And then all the benefits are recognized.
How does it actually work practically, though, Mark? These robots, you make one generation of them. There are competitors, but generally, do they work by replacing the surgeon and ironing out his or her mistakes? Or do they work by effectively making what the surgeon's trying to do a lot easier so they're less likely to make mistakes?
So at the moment, they do a few things. Number one, they shorten the learning curve. I can train a surgeon using my robot to tie a knot in about an hour. With straight stick, old style, handheld laparoscopy, tying a knot, that's probably 50 hours of practice. And many people never get it. So you speed up training. Number two, it allows more people who therefore couldn't perfect handheld laparoscopy to do it, and therefore more patients get it.
What sorts of procedures do you think are immediately amenable to what Wes Streeting has as his vision? Is it that we could point this at all surgical problems, or is it going to be a cherry pick thing? We can solve some surgical problems very, very well and narrow those waiting lists down, but there are still going to be some surgeries that we just have to do the good old fashioned way. So there's still going to be waiting lists. Which is it?
I think you've got to be very careful to over-egg it. I've always said there will never be a single robot that does everything perfectly. Some will do some things better, some will do other things better, and therefore we need to get that evidence base to work out where the best is coming from. So, for example, I will not allow my robot to be used for early-stage cervical cancer because the current evidence suggests that open surgery for cervical cancer is better than minimal access. But there are areas where one really shines. So in my system, the Versius, we've just finished a pediatric study. And one of the surgeons said, how long will it take from the finish of the study to getting the CE mark? I said, I don't know, a few months. Why? And he said, I feel it would be unethical to go back to doing laparoscopic surgery, having seen how much better and safer the Versius robot is doing pediatric surgery. But I think we don't have all the evidence yet, Chris. And I think one of the things we need to do is to be actually getting more evidence-based medicine on the ground, actually demonstrating the advantages. And it will not always be everything. And we have to stick to evidence-based.
But you're sort of doing that, aren't you? Because robots like yours, they are collecting data as you operate, and you can presumably benchmark how someone's doing.
Absolutely. I mean, if we look at the telemetry on our robot, with about a 99% accuracy, it can distinguish between a novice and an expert. So that gives glimpses of the future where you might come and do your surgical appraisal and you might have to sit on the robot, go through a few exercises, and then get marked by the robot as to how well you're doing it.
You know that Uber have got aspirations to have a fleet of unmanned taxis driving around London. Are we on the verge, Mark, with this sort of technology of having a surgeon-free operation where you go and get a robot to do the job for you?
If you'd asked me 2 years ago about autonomous surgery, I would have said never, ever. Okay. And part of the problem is respiration. When you breathe, all the organs move in different directions, and that's not predictable, and therefore it's hard to understand how you program that in for the robot to do things. The acceleration of what I'm seeing with large language models and AI and everything else is so fast that I'm not sure I would make that statement anymore. We are a software-driven robot, so I could see a situation where you get to a certain part of the operation and the robot says, at this point, 5% of surgeons get the following complication. Beware. So I can see aids coming in very quickly. I can see appraisal of skills very quickly. And I'm no longer willing to say you won't see autonomous surgery in certain areas.
It's amazing how fast all this is moving, isn't it? That was Mark Slack from CMR Surgical. And if Mark has piqued your interest in this field, he was one of our previous titans of science. And you can hear his interview recorded last year at CMR's headquarters in Cambridge on the Naked Scientist website. Head over there and look him up.
The Naked Scientists podcast is produced in association with Spitfire, cost-effective voice, internet and IP engineering services for UK businesses. Find out how Spitfire can empower your company at spitfire.co.uk.
Music in the programme is sponsored by Epidemic Sound, perfect music for audio and video productions.
This is The Naked Scientists with me, Chris Smith. Still to come, the discovery of some of the earliest known tools made from whale bones, and these are 20,000 years old. But where did our ancestors get them from? Before that, though, it's been revealed that an asteroid, which is called YR4, once thought to pose a very small threat to Earth, now has a slim but not zero chance of hitting a different nearby target entirely, and that's our moon. New observations made using the James Webb Space Telescope have refined its path and suggest there is now a 4.3% chance of a lunar impact in December 2032. The asteroid's original risk to Earth has now been downgraded to near zero, thankfully, but the story highlights the importance of tracking near-Earth objects with precision. Sarah Russell is a planetary geologist at the Natural History Museum, where she's currently poring over samples brought back from another near-Earth asteroid called Bennu. We asked her to put down her magnifying glass for a minute, though, and tell us instead what we now know about the impactor that isn't YR4.
YR4 is an asteroid which is a small rocky body. We think it's about 50 to 60 meters across. So think, about the size of an Olympic swimming pool. It's a pretty big rock. Originally came from the asteroid belt, but now it lives in an orbit that's very similar to the orbit of the Earth, a similar distance from the sun. That's why it's being tracked as something that potentially could be hazardous, as its path might one day overlap with the Earth's. It's been tracked very carefully, and there is a chance that it might hit the Earth's moon, which would be an incredibly exciting event for planetary scientists to be able to watch.
Where do we think it would likely hit, and would we be in a position to see it?
Yes, so we think as we see the moon, it will be kind of on the edge. So it will be visible to people on Earth, which will, just makes it a fantastic observing opportunity for us.
But would it be an Earth-based observation, or have we got craft in space that could turn their eyes on this as well?
Hopefully both. So it would be very much visible using telescopes, even amateur telescopes on Earth. But there are a lot of satellites around the Earth, and hopefully they will get an even better view of the impact happening.
Obviously, there's only a slim chance it's going to happen, but if it does, could it have any negative consequences, or is it so small in comparison to the size of the moon, it's just going to make a splat, and that's all?
Yeah, it will just make a splat. It's not big enough to shift the moon's orbit or anything like that. It will make a crater. Typically, an impactor will make a crater that's at least 10 times bigger than the impactor itself. So it will be at least 500 meters across, maybe more. So the moon will have a new crater that we can study. And that's actually really useful for people that study impact cratering, which is a really important process that goes on across our whole solar system. And it's used, for example, for age dating surfaces. We can look at how old a surface is by looking at how many craters it has on it. So understanding this process in more detail is always a great thing to do.
One planetary geologist put it to me a few years ago that geologists love an impact because it saves them having to do any digging. It basically scratches the surface and you can see what's in there, and nature's done it for you.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the very top surface of the moon has been quite sort of battered by the solar wind, for example, and tiny little micrometeorites. So, for example, it's a lot darker than the rock that's underneath, and these craters kind of excavate some fresh material for us to look at. So, yeah, that's another great thing about craters. We love craters.
But in more broad terms, does the fact that we're now on this like a hawk, we're able to see it, refine its trajectory, and then dismiss it as a threat to Earth, at least, that must speak volumes about how our preparedness is for this sort of thing now?
Absolutely. So this is a fantastic thing about this new generation of telescopes like James Webb, but also like Vera Rubin that's going to come online soon. These can look out for rocks that are floating around in space, even ones that are fairly small. So in astronomical terms, kind of 50, 60 meters is a fairly small rock. But we can track them all, and that really helps ensure that we can keep the Earth safe. So it's all part of this process called planetary defense. So making sure that we can work out if anything's going to hit us in the future. And if so, we can kind of scramble plans. So there are plans of things we can do. If we have enough time, we can get a spacecraft up in space that can nudge it out of the way and make sure that the Earth is protected in a way that it hasn't been in over geological time. So over the history of the Earth, there's been many impacts, some of them very, very big ones. But hopefully that won't happen in the future because of this work that astronomers are doing to track potential threats.
That's reassuring. And lastly, Sarah, when we normally talk to you, you're telling us about your pet project, which is Bennu. You've got bits of that sitting on your desk and in your laboratory. You're still delving into it. Have you got any fresh insights to share with us yet?
Oh my goodness. Actually, Chris, I'm studying Bennu in the lab today. I always get excited when I'm looking at Bennu because we always find new things. So what I'm looking at today is we found a little clast inside the material that was brought back that looks slightly different to all the other stuff. So we don't know. It might actually be an impact that was on the surface of Bennu from another body.
So an asteroid got hit by an asteroid, is that what you're saying?
It might be a piece of a different asteroid, that has been implanted into Bennu. So, but we're figuring it out.
Bonus, 2 asteroids for the price of 1. What a bargain. That was Sarah Russell. She's at the Natural History Museum. And if you want to learn more about Sarah's terrific work on Bennu, head over to thenakedscientist.com/podcast because you can hear our recent in-depth discussion between me and her when we met recently at Queen's College in Cambridge. Well, over to France now, where archaeologists have unearthed what may be some of the earliest known tools crafted from whale bones. Dating back more than 20,000 years, the discovery opens a new chapter in our understanding of how early human ancestors made use of marine resources that washed up on European shores. Jean-Marc Pétillon is an archaeologist at the French National Centre for Scientific Research in Toulouse, and he's been leading the research.
People who lived in Western Europe about 20,000 to 15,000 years ago made one part of their equipment with bone and antler. And about 15 years ago, we realized that some of them were made of whalebone. But that was just visual identification, and we couldn't say more than it's a whale. And the others were rather poorly dated because many of them are from ancient excavations. And what we did in this study is that we managed to analyze them directly by sampling a tiny part of each object to identify the species, the whale species, and to give them a date.
Where were the specimens recovered from?
The objects we analyzed are from about 27 sites, mostly are cave sites or rock shelter sites, either on the northern coast of Spain or in southwestern France, the Pyrenees area particularly.
So would the individuals who had these things, would they have gone locally to get these whales, or does this tell us anything about people trading objects like this, moving objects like this?
The place where they got the whale bones is obviously the shore of the Gulf of Biscay, and some of our sites are not very far away from the shore, but many of them are up to several hundreds of kilometers from that prehistoric shore. And it's not the first time that objects travel far from their source. At that time, we have seashells, for example, that have been perforated and used as pendants, can be found about 400 kilometers from their original place of collecting. And it's always difficult for us to know if these were the same people traveling to and from the coast of hundreds of kilometers, because they were nomadic people at the time, of course, or if they were different groups exchanging stuff, trading objects. It's actually quite difficult to know that. We don't really know what was the size of the territory of one given group at that time.
What were they turning them into?
Most of the tools they made out of whalebone are projectile points, spear points, part of their hunting equipment. Some of them are quite long and wide. We have fragments that are more than 35 centimeters long, and they're only fragments, so the complete object must have been at least 40 centimeters. And they were probably hafted on rather big projectiles, like lances or spear style, rather than arrows, for example. And most of them are found as fragments with fractures that are linked to their use. So they were used in hunting, broken in use and discarded on the cave floor.
How do you know it's whalebone, though? Because there were other big animals around at the time that would also have been able to provide big bones that you could have done all those things that you mentioned with. So why did they go for whales, and how do you know these are whales?
Land mammals have marrow cavity inside and whales don't. And the marrow is distributed over the whole thickness of the bone in small pores. So when you look at the bone in detail, it has a specific porous structure that we don't have on the land mammals. And that's how we identified them first 15 years ago. But then the precise species identification, like is it a blue whale, is it a sperm whale or whatever, this is with another technique entirely. It's paleoproteomics, which is called the Zooms method. So we sample a tiny part of the object, and it's analyzed. The collagen of the sample is analyzed because it's different from one species to another. And then we have reference library and stuff, which allow us to say, okay, this small worked fragments that we couldn't identify with the naked eye, it's made from a fin whale, for example.
Can those proteins also be dated? Is that how you can be sure when the people were exploiting these whales?
Collagen is a wonderful molecule because it has many uses for analysts, and one of them is dating. It's the very classic radiocarbon dating method. What is rather new in our study is that we used a specific technique called the MICADAS microcarbon dating system. We prepare the sample in such a way that we can date very small amounts of material. And that was necessary here, of course, because these objects are rather few, they're small, and they have a high heritage value. So you can't cut it in half and send the one half to the dating lab.
And what date do these date from then? And where were the people getting the whales from? Were they actually catching the whales, or were these people seashore dwellers and occasionally a whale carcass would roll in and that's a valuable commodity?
Most of the species that we identified are very large whales. There are fin whales, sperm whales, blue whales, gray whales, which were not hunted until rather recently. And we can't really imagine that they had the techniques and technology at that time to hunt those whales. And by the way, there is no evidence of seafaring or boats at that time anyway, and no settlements on the islands as well. So the most likely hypothesis by far is that they were using natural strandings or drifted whales that came to the shore.
Isn't that an amazing story? Jean-Marc Pétion at the French National Centre for Scientific Research in Toulouse there, and that study's just come out in Nature Communications. Well, now it's time for Question of the Week, and Marushka Subin is tackling a quantum quandary sent in by our listener Donald.
How big is a photon? Thanks, Donald. It's a simple-sounding question, but as you're about to hear, the answer takes us deep into the strange world of quantum physics. A photon is a tiny packet of energy that makes up all forms of light from the electromagnetic spectrum, from long radio waves to the warm glow of a candle to the searing rays of a gamma burst. Unlike atoms or molecules, photons don't have a mass or internal structure. So what exactly are they? And do they have a size? We called up Professor Ben Allanach, a theoretical physicist at the University of Cambridge, to help us shine some light on it.
The answer to that is a bit complicated. The short answer is no, not really. Because it's a particle, it's a quantum object, so it travels like a wave, so they'll interfere like ripples in a pond and add up or subtract. But photons are ejected and absorbed as if they were point-like objects. It hits the back of your retina like a point, but it will interfere with other photons in your eyeball like a wave. So it's a bit of both. It's one of these weird quantum objects.
In quantum physics, point-like objects have no measurable size at all. No radius, no width, no volume. We can't give photons a size when we think about them in this way. But because photons also behave like waves sometimes, does that give us one way to talk about their size, their wavelength?
You can't measure its size directly, but you can only detect them if the thing that you're detecting is, of roughly the right size to the wavelength. That's why satellite dishes are 30 centimeters wide, because that's roughly the wavelength of the photons that you're detecting with that. So that's radio waves, and they can be meters or many centimeters long. Whereas visible light is more like 500 nanometers. So, that's roughly half a millionth of a meter. And if you decrease the wavelength, you go up to X-rays, and then to gamma rays, which come in from space and so on.
So, Donald, to answer your question, a photon doesn't really have a size in the way we're used to thinking about things. It has no surface or an inside. It's a quantum ripple that can stretch across space depending on its energy. It has properties related to its wavelength, but still acts like a point when it hits something? Thanks again for your question, and to Professor Ben Alanak for helping us unravel it. Next time, we're answering this question from Tony.
When I'm cycling around the Suffolk countryside, I regularly notice that the clouds aren't moving in the same direction that the wind is blowing me. Sometimes they're moving in the opposite direction, other times across the wind I'm feeling, and only occasionally in the same direction. Does this mean that high and low pressure areas are in different places depending on altitude, or is something else going on here?
And that is a very good question. And if you can help Tony, or you have a question of your own you'd like us to look into, why not pop onto our forum at nakedscientist.com/forum, or send it in to me, and it could become a feature of a future edition of the programme. The address to write to is chris@thenakedscientist.com. That's all we've got time for today. Do tune in on Tuesday, though, when our titan of science is the top microbiologist and now also Master of Churchill College, Cambridge, Sharon Peacock. Remember all those variants that were reported each week during the pandemic and what was going up and what was going down? Well, Sharon set up COG UK, the genome sequencing consortium that generated those amazing live insights into COVID-19. Her story is fascinating. You can hear it next week. The Naked Scientist comes to you from the University of Cambridge's Institute of Continuing Education. It's supported by Rolls-Royce. I'm Chris Smith. Thank you for listening. And until next time, goodbye.